best meat.
The Huntress, equipped with Spear and Buckler, seamlessly weaves melee and ranged attacks together using high mobility and powerful counterattacks and skill combinations. It's a playstyle unlike anything that we've had in Path of Exile up to this point. Attempting to make this overview skill guide has proven very challenging. With my previous mercenary hands-on guide, I could simply talk about each skill individually and maybe just note one or two of the interactions that come up. But for the Huntress, it's not so simple. So many of the skills interact with each other in different ways. You can play some pretty simple and organic feeling skill combinations without being quite so overcomplicated, but it's when you start to consider all of the possible interactions and options that you have available to you, quickly things become really complex and really interesting. I think it's definitely the most dynamic and engaging playstyle that GGG have released thus far. So here's my overview of the Huntress, Spear, and Buckler skills from my hands-on time at the GGG studios. This guide will be in two parts. Part 1 has skills up to level 5, and Part 2 has the rest. Spears are one-handed only and cannot be dual-wielded. There's definitely a bit of synergy with Bucklers, but technically you can just use a normal shield or even no offhand with the Dance with Death keystone. Spears are fundamentally hybrid melee ranged weapons, and they come pre-packaged with both Spear Stab and Spear Throw basic skills. Both of these are decent single target skills and cost 0 mana, so they're fine choices while leveling for some easy boss poking. The devs actually want these to be on the higher end of raw damage compared to other skills because, and this was how it was phrased to me, they don't do anything else, so they might as well deal some damage. Spear Throw can actually consume a Frenzy Charge to create a small explosion. There's no real reason to do this, but it's a cute little addition. It's mainly because the idea is that every single Spear Throwing skill can consume a Frenzy Charge for some benefit, so they wanted to keep it consistent even with the basic one. Bucklers, which are the new pure evasion shields, all come paired with the Parry skill. This works the same as Raise Shield in that you hold the button down to block incoming attacks, with some key differences. Projectiles can only be blocked with Parry if they're fired from within 1 meter of you. After a successful Parry block, the enemy's struck for a small amount of damage, they're light stunned, and they gain the Parry debuff for 2 seconds. This Parry debuff causes them to take 50% more attack damage for that duration, and that's from anything. It doesn't have to be a specific skill, just any attack. But the Parry debuff can also be consumed by some specific skills that we'll go into later. As normal, you can parry any regular melee attack or spell, you just cannot parry slams or explosions, or the big red flashy boss abilities basically. While parrying, you won't evade attacks, but evasion still does do something. It prevents heavy stun buildup. And on that note, and this is not specific to Parry but just globally across the board, heavy stun is now a fair bit more punishing towards players. That said, evasion scaling in the nature of how you tend to actually parry and then counterattack made this rarely an issue for me after the beginning. I did get heavy stunned a few times, but it really caught me by surprise. And long term, it almost started never happening. Unlike other games with Parry, there's no timing requirement here. You don't have to get some sort of perfect thing right as a certain part of the attack is happening. You just channel the parry skill, hold it as long as you want until an attack is automatically parried, as long as you're within range of it if it's a projectile, or as long as it was going to hit you if it's a melee attack. Generally speaking, you'll hold the parry skill down, the parry will occur, and then you'll counterattack with some ability to take advantage of the parry debuff. There's no real skill component here outside of just knowing what things you can parry. And since that's consistent in that it's close range projectiles or any attack that's not a slam, basically, it's a pretty easy thing for you to learn over time. My opinion on Parry walking away from this was really positive. It's important, fun, and really effective. It can downright embarrass some of the bosses where you just kind of like chain parry them with follow-up attacks and they feel like they can't really do anything to you a lot of the time. But then at other times, there are some bosses that mostly only do slams and they have very limited things that you can actually parry. Since there's some differences in the types of enemies you face, you'll end up changing your playstyle, and that adds to the overall dynamic feel of the Huntress. One boss you'll be parrying a lot and doing a lot of parry-based counterattacks, and other ones you'll be doing a bit more dodge rolling and hit and run tactics. There are a bunch of parry nodes on the passive tree too. They often come packaged or next to passive block chance, which makes them much more appealing. Many of the nodes do things like parry debuff duration, which is pretty handy for kind of more grace in the follow-up attack timings. It's hard to say if something like full parry investment will be worth it, but since block is great anyway, I'm pretty keen to experiment with it in my builds. Now this video is all about skills, so how appropriate then that Boot.dev has returned to be my sponsor once again. That's right, this is the sponsored segment. Boot.dev is all about learning back-end web development skills like coding in Python and Go, as well as practical skills like applying for jobs in the industry. I like to use anything I promote to ensure that it's actually worthwhile, and I've been using Boot.dev to learn more about coding and game development, which it makes super approachable with step-by-step courses and practical projects like making a Pokédex. Even with my very sporadic use of it, I keep making progress because it's actually has me do things like bug fix code to learn, which is something that I engage with a lot more than if it was just straight up theoretical knowledge. And even when I actually do tend to forget things, which is all the time, it has tools like the Spellbook, which is easy to search, basically automatically compiled notes. Oh my god, why didn't I have this in university? And then for stuff that I just don't understand what it's trying to get me to do, it has the Boots AI built in that contextually knows what you know already and what you're currently doing, what the task is, and it does a good job of explaining things like an actual teacher would, based on what's going on. There's free demos for every course and a 30-day no questions asked refund policy for the subscription if you decide to get that, which you can pick up with my discount code ZiggyDGaming for 25% off your first month or first year. But enough about real-life practical skills. Let's talk about far more important things, the Huntress skills. The first skill you get from the tutorial is actually Whirling Slash, but I wanted to talk about Disengage first, as it's the follow-up to Parry that you get access to the earliest. Disengage ended up being the skill I found myself cutting first in my different runs. It's a slashing backflip with a small AoE. It has a short cooldown, so you can't quite use it end to end, but you can do things like use Disengage, dodge roll, move a little bit, then disengage again pretty smoothly. It flips you away from your mouse cursor or target, but you can obviously use that to flip you forwards or sideways, depending on where you aim. It seems to work similarly to dodge overall, and it can be used to animation cancel too from other attacks, could be used while using other attacks. And it also does avoid damage. It guarantees strikes and projectiles miss you while you're flipping. When the attack portion hits a target that has the parry debuff as well, it causes a chunky little explosion and consumes the debuff to give you a frenzy charge. Since quite a few things want frenzy charges for powerful buffs, the early game strategy of parry, disengage, then throw an empowered spear is very good and quite fun. Both this and parry being easy to pull off make the whole thing way more fun too. It's a simple skill that does a lot for the overall feeling of mobility and that hit and run and ranged melee combination that the Huntress is going for. It really encourages it, I think. Personally, I never took Disengage off my skill bar for even a second. It felt like a core class mechanic to me, just like dodge roll. I ended up using the Ingenuity support to lower its cooldown, which felt quite nice. And that paired with a bit of incidental parry debuff duration meant that it was really easy to, even if I first missed my first attempt at Disengage to try and get that frenzy charge, I would usually be able to do a second one as a follow-up thanks to that combination. The support gem I really loved on Disengage though was Shocking Leap, which I believe is a new one. It puts down some shocked ground on use. Since you use Disengage on top of enemies a lot of the time, that leaves them shocked exactly when you plan to follow up with some sort of empowered spear throw, for example. It's also really great paired with triggering explosions on whirlwinds from our next skill, Whirling Slash. So Whirling Slash is the first of the wind-themed skills, bit of an archetype here within the Huntress. It's a combo piece for quite a few other skills as well. Quite simply, you slash in a circle for fairly low damage and create a whirlwind. Each Whirling Slash adds a stage to the whirlwind, increasing its area up to 3 total stages. If you leave the whirlwind area, such as just walking away or dodge rolling or indeed disengaging out of it, it explodes, dealing more damage per stage in that larger area. Its main use early on is AoE for packs of enemies. You'll slash and slash and slash, and then dodge roll away or disengage, detonating it and killing the enemies. You'll get a feel for how much damage you need to do to the enemies before you detonate, so you might end up doing an extra slash here or there to get them low enough so that the detonate will kill them, but this is something you get a feel for as your gear evolves. It's less single target just outright used than Spear Stab in most cases, but you can build whirlwinds ahead of time for single target situations, like for example when you're moving to engage an enemy, or if you're waiting for a boss to spawn, for example, you can pre-place those whirlwinds so that when you're forced to move, like a dodge roll or something, it'll detonate, dealing a bit of extra damage. Not to mention that whirlwind blinds enemies, so it's nice to just have down ahead of time. It's a pretty core skill for the early game and feels quite good, but does need a little bit of kind of practice and tips for using it. So here's some things that I noted. The slash has a forward leap if targeted ahead of you so that you can use it as a gap closer. And that's kind of what you should do. Think of it like hit and run, using that whirling slash to advance on enemies and push them and group them up since it has that knockback, and then use your disengage to explode or dodge roll to get out of the way and explode, and then follow up with more Whirling Slashes. That's kind of the core little combo there. If you want to place them underneath yourself and you don't want to move around, because sometimes you don't really want to be moving around so much, you can just target right underneath yourself and you won't actually do that little dash. Something that's really good is you can drag the whirlwind around with you by using that built-in movement. Every time you do a slash, it repositions the whirling slash that you're currently inside of. When you use Disengage to leap out of it to trigger that explosion with shocking leap support on Disengage, that shock ground does actually apply to that explosion, which is really fantastic. Some suggested supports include the new one, Cadence. This would work well a lot of the time, I think, here, because you're doing 3 attacks, then doing something else, then another 3. So you should maintain something like a 30 to 60% attack speed buff a lot of the time, but you shouldn't ever hit that downside of attacking 8 times in 4 seconds, because you're going to be mixing up the skills you're doing, typically with Whirling Slash, and not just slashing endlessly. So you're never really going to have that cooldown effect. Kind of a neat little support gem. Alternatively, the much more simple approach of Martial Tempo is solid and just makes things nicer for setting up whirlwinds for twisters that we'll talk about in a moment. I found myself using Bloodlust on it to scale damage if the target was bleeding, which is easily done with other skills like Rake, so that's a nice damage scaling option, even in non-bleed builds. And since, especially with Martial Tempo or Cadence, it's something you're hitting with quite often, it can be used for building up Rage stacks with the Rage support, for example. So next up is Twister, and this is the natural pairing with Whirling Slash. It simply sends a projectile that pierces through all targets and bounces off walls until it runs out of duration. The Twister is blind as well, which is a nice defensive buff to be able to apply guaranteed on enemies at a range like this. Like whirlwinds, when twisters travel over ground effects, they actually gain that element and deal 30% added elemental damage of that type. When they collide with a whirlwind from skills such as Whirling Slash, they consume the whirlwind to deal more damage and create more projectiles. Just note this doesn't cause the whirlwind to explode like it normally would. It consumes it to do this alternate effect with twisters specifically. So if you fire a whirlwind into a stage 3 twister, that means 180% more damage and 4 whirlwinds instead of 1. So that's pretty substantial payoff. As a baseline, twisters deal less damage than just using like basic spear throw, but you know, they pierce and they can bounce around and they can hit the target again as they bounce and come back. Pretty nice in enclosed areas, and when they're fully buffed with added elemental damage, they do tend to deal quite a bit more damage overall. They cannot shotgun with multiple projectiles though, even if it's created from the whirlwind, but more projectiles can make it more likely for extra hits after bouncing, so you can still end up getting more single target damage with extra projectile. I did test with and without Scattershot, and overall I didn't really like Scattershot on this, mostly preferring to use the whirlwind buff instead. Overall, the skill works really well in small arenas or in tighter spaces, and it can be really nicely combined with whirlwind for kind of encountering dangerous packs and dealing with them before you get, you know, in too much danger. It's a bit like Spark, so duration and projectile speed are both options for scaling it so that you can hit more targets, bounce off walls, and hit the enemy again. I did find myself using this quite a lot, off and on, in different zones. Sometimes it performed really, really well, and other times it was just okay. It's especially nice when you just incidentally have some elemental ground effects around, and that includes even just the shocked ground from Disengage, which naturally puts the shocked ground between you and your target, so it's kind of perfect. For other support options, there's plenty of things you can do with this, but the Pursuit and Retreat supports, the new ones, felt like a great combo with this and Whirlwind. So let's talk about them. The hybrid melee ranged playstyle of the Huntress and Spears is encapsulated in a brand new pair of support gems here, which kind of naturally go together. Pursuit makes the linked melee attack deal 30% more melee damage if you damage an enemy with a projectile attack in the last 8 seconds. And conversely, Retreat is the opposite. 25% more projectile damage if you've damaged an enemy with a melee hit in the last 8 seconds. You get what they're going for here, it's pretty obvious. Both have an additional restriction though, preventing the linked skills from doing the other type of damage. This is likely just to prevent issues with like hybrid skills, like Monk's Falling Thunder for example, that have both a melee and projectile component. I didn't run into this at all playing on an actual Huntress. The simplest and most obvious pairing here is just Whirling Slash and Twister, right? They combo together nicely, they're melee and ranged. But that said, the 8 seconds is pretty long, and you can even activate Retreat pretty easily by just using on mobility skills like Thunderous Leap or Disengage. You disengage, you hit the target, that gives you 8 seconds of uptime on your damage scaling for your projectile skill. Very nice. The next skill in that first tier of those level 1 gems is Explosive Spear, and this is one of my favorites. It throws a low damage spear that detonates after 2.5 seconds to deal a powerful fire damage explosion. Now you can only have one active spear at a time, and you have to wait for it to detonate before you throw another one, otherwise you'll override it and it'll never detonate. So there's some level of self-control that you need to apply here. That said, consuming a frenzy charge causes it to detonate instantly, leaving behind burning ground. Explosive Spear's explosion, whether it's with frenzy charge or after the delay, acts as a detonator, meaning that it can detonate other skills that we'll see later on, like Stormlance or Rapid Assault's stuck spearheads. Explosive Spear overall is very satisfying and effective. The limit on active spears and the longer detonation time actually means that you weave it in between your other skills and combine it opportunistically. Whenever you find a parry opportunity, you can disengage to make a frenzy charge, Explosive Spear for that burning ground and some nice damage, and then follow up with Whirling Slash or Twisters to empower them with that added fire damage. Most builds I think will use this for at least a while in Act 1. It's just a good leveling skill for that early portion of the game, if nothing else. But that said, it's definitely got core skill potential, and it was one of the main skills I ended up using in the elemental build that I fell into, combined with Stormlance. For supports, you've got your obvious choices like Fire Imbuement and Primal Armament, Concentrated Effect or Magnified Effect if you want more area of effect, for example. And you could do things with Persistence or Despoiler for burning ground duration, of course, if you're using it mostly to buff your Whirlwinds or Twisters. The gem I liked the most, though, was Overabundance, which is +1 charge and 50% less duration. The duration doesn't actually affect the detonation time, which would obviously probably be a good thing, but that's okay. The extra charge, though, is excellent. It means you can throw 2 down and have 2 explosions for a bit more coverage, and it makes it a little bit easier to not accidentally override yourself and still get those explosions for detonating. The only thing that is affected by the less duration is the burning ground, so it's not as good for applying that effect, but there's plenty of other ways to do that, if you're playing some kind of wind build and need ground effects. On to the level 3 skill gems. We'll start off with Lightning Spear, which I know a lot of people are excited for. This throws a lightning spear with a boosted chance to shock enemies. The spear itself cannot pierce, fork, or chain or really do anything, but when it hits a target or a wall, it splits lightning bolts to enemies in a large area. Adding more projectiles doesn't affect that core spear, which is a running theme for these spear throws, but it does affect the split lightning bolts themselves, which are projectiles. The frenzy charge adds more splits and more damage overall, turning it into a bit of a clear speed beast. The splits have full lightning conversion as well, and even more chance to shock too, so particularly good for shocking there. It should be quite nice with Barrage, but I didn't really get much of a chance to test that. And the Innovate support is obviously a pretty good choice here to gain lightning damage on killing shocked enemies. To me, this felt less useful for leveling though than other options that I had access to, but I can definitely see this being a clear speed machine at endgame, especially if you can keep a steady supply of frenzy charges going for those empowered splits. Fangs of Frost is next up, a simple icy stab attack that has its own unique payoff on parried enemies. So when striking a parry debuffed enemy, it causes an icy explosion that leaves chilled ground. This means it can be used as an elemental ground source for wind skills, but I don't really think that's going to be the main use case for it here. Both the explosion and stab have 50% more freeze buildup, and the high damage on the explosion does make for some pretty solid freeze potential. By default, it's not stronger than regular spear stab for raw single target DPS, and I initially kind of wrote it off as not too useful as I wanted to use those parry debuffs to make frenzy charges. Why would I want to consume it for Fangs of Frost when I want to throw my exploding spears and stuff? But I did end up changing my mind on this skill completely later on. When I started getting frenzies from other sources, I found it much more useful overall. With the Combat Frenzy Spirit skill, freezing enemies can generate you easy frenzy charges, and this made it become a core skill in my eventual elemental spear throwing build. A quick poke on trash monsters is a near guaranteed freeze, and therefore a frenzy charge. Great. Much easier than trying to do a parry and disengage. And then when you do use parry for a tougher enemy, you can follow up with the Fangs of Frost for an even more higher chance of getting that freeze. And with decent supports like Cold Infusion and Pursuit, for example, it became a pretty solid high damage and satisfying melee skill to weave in on an otherwise ranged playstyle that I was messing with. The next skill is Spear Field, which is a slightly unusual one that I initially penned as mostly a utility skill, but I think has some pretty strong potential. With Spear Field, you stab the ground and see many spears emerge from the ground in a cone. These spears will explode when enemies come into contact with them, so either when you summon them into an enemy, or if the enemy walks into them or is pushed into them. The spear explosions maim enemies with additional maim effect, slowing their movement speed considerably, and dealing a decent little chunk of damage. Nothing too crazy for single explosions, but obviously this is something that you can do more with and build up a bit. I did kind of write this one off initially, but then when I tried it again much later on, and again on a second run, I was focusing more on like a Bleed Fizz character, it did start to blow me away a little bit. You get a spear every 0.2 meters of space, so the way this skill works is more AoE equals more spears, but they don't cluster tighter if you use something like Concentrated Effect, for example. It has a maximum of 70 spears total, and they seem to start replacing after about 3 uses of the skill. So although the amount of spears you get per 0.2 meters of space is fixed, you can stack the spear fields on top of each other. So you can stack 3 on top of each other and get quite a bit more damage clustered for where a boss is going to be walking through, for example. So a bit of a hypothetical here, this is just some theory crafting. With Concentrated Effect, you may be able to stack more and deal more damage in the same location, because maybe you are getting less AoE, which means less spears are being kind of put down per use of the skill. So that means maybe you could do 4 or 5 spear fields on top of each other for single target, or you just spam them into the boss, deleting them as they spawn. Still, Concentrated Effect would be very good there for that. Quality is quite interesting in this as well. It has a chance for hazards to rearm, and I did see this kind of hazard keyword elsewhere on the passive skill tree, for example, which it's basically any like damage dealing effect that's left behind from a skill. So basically this and Frost Wall. There's new passives in the Huntress area that affect hazards in various ways, such as rearm chance, and rearm chance for something like this is just a direct damage multiplier. 15% chance to rearm is 15% more damage. It's effective against larger enemies and very effective against enemies that move around or chase you. I kind of wonder if you could use knockback from the spears to push enemies into more spears. So some knockback on the skill itself, or globally perhaps. It would probably take some investment, but could be interesting to look at. I actually think this is a super strong skill against the right types of enemies and built around correctly, in addition to providing some decent utility for slowing enemies down in ranged or bleed builds. Keep in mind that a moving enemy gains bonus bleed damage, and if they're walking slower, they spend more time overall walking to get where they want to be. Speaking of bleed builds, the next skill is Rake, the last of the level 3 skills, and this is a bleed-themed mobility skill. Rake is a slashing attack that leaps forwards to a target if possible. It's got a moderate range when targeted on a specific enemy, otherwise it's just a small leap forwards. It takes a bit of practice to get used to what enemies you can reach to max range with it, but it's really zippy overall, and it can dash you around enemies, and it kind of path finds around obstacles really well too, to travel you really far sometimes. And that's good because it does up to 100% more damage based on the distance traveled. You're incentivized to use it to hit and run or as a gap closer after you flip away with Disengage, for example. Now it has a 100% chance to inflict a bleed and 100% more magnitude of bleed, in addition to that up to 100% more damage based on distance, so there's some decent bleed scaling going on here. It's got a somewhat low base attack damage, but all of those kind of multipliers put together mean that it ends up being a pretty good skill, if nothing else for clear, and surprisingly actually good for single target as like a hit and run combined with some other skills. It's really fast and fun skill. I liked it a lot. A useful mobility even on non-bleed builds too. The combo of Rake, Whirlwind, Parry, Disengage, and then Rake again, just kind of like that dash in, flip back combo. It was really fun. Obviously, brutality, heft, and deep cuts are going to be there for bleed damage. Cadence and martial tempo if you want to use it more for speed and maneuverability. And I actually stumbled upon Stomping Ground as a support for this, which is really fun. Rake moves so fast and there's kind of a lot of steps, so Stomping Ground adds a bunch of hits to make Rake a better single target and clear skill at the same time. You just kind of have a little bit of strength for the damage to be based on while leveling, but because on a bleed build you need a bunch of red supports, you're going to have some strength anyway, and just with the strength I kind of needed from and got from some incidental gear, I found this combo was very strong. Definitely a cool combo. One to have a look at for sure. Since we're talking about bleed skills, it's time for the skill with the edgiest, sickest name of all time.
Herald of Blood.
Herald of Blood is, as name suggests, a new bleed-oriented herald skill, which means you get access to it at gem level 4, also known as gem level 10 after killing the King of the Mists. While active, killing an enemy that has experienced quote-unquote blood loss causes them to explode, dealing physical attack damage in an area. So blood loss is this new system where the total bleed damage on enemies can be tracked and seen on the life bars as this kind of like missing portion of life. You'll only see it whenever you have a skill or an effect that cares about blood loss in some way. So as soon as you put Herald of Blood on, you'll start seeing it on enemies. The explosion has some base physical damage, but the bulk of its damage is actually based on the total blood loss of the exploded enemy. It's 15% of the exploding enemy's blood loss total. So this is an unscalable value, which is typical for effects like this, since it's already effectively has been scaled by your damage damage in the first place via the actual bleed in the first place. A bit like Plague Bearer from Path of Exile 1 if you're familiar. What this means is that even just 1 point of bleed damage is enough to cause Herald of Blood to explode for a small amount of damage, regardless of whether the enemy actually dies to bleed or another hit or something else, just as long as they experience blood loss at some point, even if they've stopped bleeding entirely. But enemies that have had a lot of blood loss, say primarily dying to like a large bleed from Rake, for example, will cause some very chunky, high damage explosions. As an added bonus, the explosion can aggravate bleed on nearby targets, which makes the bleed deal its bonus damage as if the target was moving. This alongside the explosion should help clear up stragglers and give bleed builds that juicy AoE clear that they desperately need. Although it's an attack and requires a martial weapon to equip and activate, it doesn't scale off of your weapon damage, so maybe you can do some clever things with that perhaps. It's pretty satisfying and effective at even leveling a build that's not really focused on bleed and using Rake for mobility. It was great for AoE clear. You can of course support it as well, just keep in mind that the blood loss damage is unscalable, so you mostly want to stick to things like Magnified Effect for extra area or utility supports, I imagine. Now moving on to skill level 5, we'll start with Rapid Assault. This skill performs 6 small stabs in a pretty fast sequence and then a large final strike. It seemed like a partial lock-in skill to me, but I think you can interrupt between the 6 fast stabs and then the final large one if needed. But there is some kind of element to commitment to it. It's a skill that you want to use when you can kind of do so safely. The final strike is definitely the most important part of the skill, and it has pretty long range, which means it'll often connect even if you miss that first combo, which is nice. And that final strike is guaranteed to cause bleeding and has a small knockback for a bit of bonus bleed damage as well. Finally, that final strike lodges a stuck spearhead in the target for up to 10 seconds, and you can have a total of 5 stuck spearheads in a target if you can do so quickly enough. The spearheads themselves don't do anything, but if they're hit by a detonator skill, they explode, dealing some extra damage in a small explosion. At gem level 5, it was 85% damage per explosion, so it's not a ton, but that does total to over 400% if you get all 5 in and then detonate them. So it makes it a decent final punch finisher. Mechanically, I think this works quite nicely. When the enemy is vulnerable, you hit them with a few rapid assaults. Then when they start moving again, you detonate the spearheads with an explosive spear or a thunderous leap. Depending on your build, you might be throwing detonators anyway, so that extra damage is just bound to happen as a bonus. When you kind of math out the small rapid hits, the big final hit, and then the potential detonations down the line, it does end up being quite good single target. The bleed does, however, seem kind of supplementary here with no real major bonus or like heavy hit from that final strike to, to give it that extra punch that a bleed really needs. Overall, it's a solid single target skill that'll probably see use in a variety of builds, I expect, especially if they do have a detonator skill kind of already in their gameplay rotation. And of course, don't forget things like detonating arrow, explosive grenades, and explosive shot all exist for weapon swap setups. Next up, Stormlance is another thrown spear skill and one of my other favorites alongside Explosive Spear, which it happens to pair very nicely with. This skill has got a lot going on, so hold on to your butts. Stormlance sees you throw a spear that pierces enemies and lodges in the ground, where it then proceeds to intermittently zap nearby enemies with chaining bolts of lightning. You can have 3 active Stormlancers in the ground at any one time zapping away, but you can only throw 1 spear at a time, so Scattershot is out, thankfully I think, but Barrage is an option. The stuck spears are detonatable, but they won't detonate by themselves. If they are hit by a detonator, such as Explosive Spear's explosion, they'll rapidly fire out 16 bolts near instantly in a larger area before expiring. It's pretty chunky damage, especially with 3 of them stacked in one place and then detonated. But of course, all thrown skills have a frenzy charged version, and Stormlance is no different. When consuming a frenzy charge, Stormlance will fire bolts 4 times faster and detonate itself, causing shocked ground. It's basically 3 skills in one: the basic AoE zaps, detonated mega zaps, and frenzy charge machine gun zaps with shocked ground. And they're all a little bit different in how they function. I love this skill and I just kept coming back to it. My primary elemental build on my first run through to the mid 50s or so was Stormlance and Explosive Spear, combined with frenzy charge generation from Sniper's Mark for single target and combat frenzy otherwise. I used electrocute support on this skill to convert the damage from shock chance to electrocute to passively feed me frenzy charges, which worked quite well. And that's nice because the empowered version still causes shocked ground anyway, so you're not really missing out on anything there. Just the opportunity cost of using the gem, I suppose. I'd throw 1 or 2 Stormlancers, 1 or 2 explosives with the extra charge support, and then extra Stormlancers as the explosives started detonating to keep a continuous rumble of Stormfire. And those would just be getting passively empowered as frenzied charges kind of trickled in better and better as I got more and more investment as I went. It's safe to say that Stormlance is a hard recommend from me. based on my first impressions, though I can see Lightning Spear outperforming it on pure clear speed, of course, but this is a nice combined AoE and single target skill. The final skill I did want to mention is Barrage. It's not technically a new skill, but it is available here on this line and has been reworked a little bit to have its functionality expanded to include thrown spear attacks in addition to bow attacks. This means that it doesn't work for Twister, which isn't a thrown spear. It's a projectile attack, but you don't actually throw your spear, but it will for the rest of the thrown spears. If you're unfamiliar, Barrage works by you cast a quick spell that gives you a little buff that then empowers your next attack, compatible, to have 2 additional repeats, basically. One thing to remember is that it also consumes frenzy charges to add additional repeats, and that's a good thing, but here in these builds, it may consume the frenzy charges that you intended to empower a spear throw instead, so it's not necessarily all upside there. Let's do a quick rundown on the functionality with the thrown spears as I see it. Explosive Spear is bad with Barrage because of the limited number of active explosive spears being 1 by default or 2 with the support. Either way, if you throw 3, it's kind of wasted. You're better off just not barraging and throwing them separately most likely. Lightning Spear does seem good with Barrage. You use Barrage as you're moving between packs of enemies to empower it, and then you unleash 3 Lightning Spears to clear a large area. Great. I'm not entirely sure of the interaction with frenzy charges on the throw, as there was some inconsistencies here and there that were still being worked on, so we'll have to see where that lands once the developers have finalized those mechanics. Like, I'm not sure if it takes 3 frenzy charges to empower a full barrage, or if it's just 1 frenzy charge for the full barrage. Obviously, the latter would be much stronger there, but we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. Stormlance is a pretty good pairing with this too. With the limit of active Stormlances being 3, you can barrage a set of 3 and then focus on using other skills for some nice front-loaded damage, so pretty good. As Glacial Lance was not playable in my test, I cannot comment on it. We'll have to wait and see for that one. Whirling Lance does seem like one of the best pairings. I didn't think to re-equip Barrage when I got it, unfortunately, to test. Sorry about that, but Barrage gives 3 projectiles, and that's an instant 3 stages with the whirlwinds that the Lance creates. That'll be in part 2, so we can look at that then. Overall, Barrage didn't feel mandatory, which I appreciate. I like that it just kind of felt like a potentially good option depending on the skill you're using. I ended up rotating it out for other skills long term, as there was a lot I wanted to use on the Huntress, and the slots were pretty tight, honestly, more so than ever before. I did not have enough skill slots, despite how many you actually get. I can see Barrage being a part of some setups based on more player preference than anything else, so that sounds pretty good. We'll see how it pans out. But that's it for part 1. In part 2, I'll cover the skills from level 7, 9, 11, and 13, as well as some of the Amazon Ascendancy skills and mechanics. We'll also take a look at Team Beast, but just as a heads up, I didn't get a chance to try the rower mount, so you'll have to wait till launch to see more on that. That's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.